The rain in the Ironworks district didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. It was a freezing, relentless downpour that seeped into the bones, the kind of weather that reminded Michelle that her coat was 3 years old and 2 sizes too big, a hand-me-down from a sheltered drive. She adjusted the heavy plastic grocery bags cutting into her fingers, her breath hitching in her throat as she hurried down the cracked sidewalk. The neon sign of the corner liquor store buzzed with an angry, dying hum, illuminating the puddles in shades of bruised purple and electric blue. Michelle didn't look at the shadows in the alleyways. She kept her eyes forward, her mind a frantic calculator of survival. Rent was 3 days late. The electricity bill was sitting on the kitchen counter like a judge's gavel. And Marcus, her eldest at 15, was growing out of his shoes faster than she could pick up extra shifts at the diner. She had 3 of them, Marcus, little Elijah, and baby Zara. They were the fire in her chest that kept her moving when her legs wanted to give out. But tonight, the fire felt like panic. She turned the corner onto her street, expecting the usual quiet hum of the neighborhood settling in for the night. But instead, she saw flashing lights. Not police lights. These were the hazard lights of 3 black SUVs parked haphazardly in front of the old auto body shop at the end of the block. The shop that had been bought out a few months ago, the windows tinted black, the sign simply reading Lotus Automotive. A crowd had gathered. Michelle's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw a familiar oversized hoodie in the center of the circle. Marcus! The scream tore out of her throat raw and primal. She dropped the grocery bags. The milk carton split on the pavement, leaking white into the gutter oil, but she didn't care. She sprinted toward the circle of men in dark suits. They were statues, unmoving, their faces impassive in the rain. In the center of them stood her son, trembling, a baseball bat hanging loosely from his grip. Beside him lay a shattered tragedy. A pristine, midnight blue sedan, a machine that cost more than Michelle would earn in 10 lifetimes, now sporting a spiderweb fracture across its windshield and a deep dent in the hood. "I didn't mean to," Marcus was stammering, his voice cracking, terrified tears mixing with the rain on his face. "The ball, it just went wild. I tried to catch it." One of the men in suits stepped forward, his hand moving inside his jacket. Michelle didn't think. She didn't calculate. She launched herself between the man and her son, spreading her arms wide, a lioness shielding her cub. "Don't you touch him," she snarled, her eyes wild, her chest heaving. "He's a child. It was an accident. I'll pay for it. I swear to God I'll pay for it. Just don't touch him." The man paused, looking down at her with a mix of annoyance and boredom. "You have no idea what this car is worth," he said, his accent clipped. "You cannot pay." "I will work. I will do anything." "Please," she begged, the ferocity bleeding into desperation. She grabbed Marcus's shoulder, pulling him tighter into her. The circle of men parted. It wasn't a forceful movement, but a respectful retreat, like the tide pulling back before a storm. From the open bay doors of the garage emerged a man. He wasn't wearing a suit like the others. He wore a simple black turtleneck and dark trousers, impeccable despite the industrial setting. He held a cigarette loosely in one hand, the embers glowing bright against the gloom. He was Korean, handsome in a way that felt sharp and dangerous, like the edge of a straight razor. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools that swept over the scene, the shattered glass, the trembling boy, and the soaking wet woman with fury in her eyes standing between them. This was Jinho. The neighborhood whispered his name, but few had seen him this close. The boss. He took a drag of the cigarette, exhaling a plume of smoke that drifted into the rain. He walked up to the car, running a hand over the dent. The silence stretched so tight Michelle thought it might snap her neck. "The boy threw the ball?" Jinho asked, his voice low, a smooth baritone that carried easily over the rain. "It was an accident," Michelle pleaded, stepping closer, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "He was playing. He's stupid, he's a stupid kid, but he didn't mean it. Look at me. Don't look at him, look at me. I take the debt." Jinho turned his gaze to her. He looked at her wet hair plastered to her face, the worn-out coat, and then his eyes dropped to her hands, rough, calloused, shaking but balled into fists. He looked back at Marcus, who was trying to be brave but was clearly terrified. "Do you know who I am?" Jinho asked Michelle. "I know you run this block," she said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "I know you're the man I have to beg, so I'm begging." Jinho tilted his head. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not pity, pity was for the weak. It was something closer to recognition. He saw the way she stood. He saw the absolute willingness to die right there on the pavement if it meant the man in the suit didn't get to her son. He dropped the cigarette and crushed it beneath his expensive shoe. "Get the boy inside," he said to his men. "No," Michelle screamed, lunging, but two men caught her arms. They weren't rough, but they were immovable walls of muscle. "Inside," Jinho corrected, looking directly at Michelle to dry off. "And you bring her." They were ushered into the garage. It was warm inside, smelling of oil, leather, and expensive cologne. The lighting was stark. Jinho leaned against a workbench, crossing his arms. He nodded to one of his subordinates who handed Marcus a towel. The boy took it, looking at his mother for permission. She nodded, her breathing shallow. "The windshield alone is 5,000, Jinho stated calmly. "The hood work, the paint matching. Another 10, perhaps. $15,000. It might as well have been $1 billion. Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. I can pay in installments. I work at the diner on 4th and I clean offices on weekends." "It would take you 20 years, Jinho said coldly, "and the interest would bury you in the first month." Michelle felt the tears finally spill over. "Please, he's my son." Jinho watched her for a long moment. He saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, the poverty hanging off her like a shroud, and yet the fire remained. He respected fire. "He works it off," Jinho said. Michelle blinked. "What?" "The boy, Marcus," Jinho gestured to the teenager. "He comes here every day after school. He sweeps. He cleans the tools. He learns to detail the cars. He does exactly what my floor manager tells him to do. If he is late, the debt doubles. If he steals, the debt doubles. If he lies, the debt doubles." "You want him to work for you?" Michelle asked, suspicious. "Just work, nothing illegal." Jinho's lips quirked in a ghost of a smile. "I run a legitimate automotive restoration business, MS." "Michelle," she whispered. "Michelle Vance." "Ms. Vance, I don't need a 15-year-old running drugs. I need my shop floor swept." He looked at Marcus. "Can you handle a broom, boy?" "Yes, sir," Marcus squeaked. "Good, start tomorrow at 4 p.m. Jinho pushed off the workbench. "Go home, both of you." Michelle didn't move immediately. She stared at him, trying to find the trap. There was always a trap, but Jinho had already turned his back, examining a disassembled engine block. She grabbed Marcus's hand, and they fled into the night. The first week was agonizing. Every minute Marcus was at the shop, Michelle stared at the clock, terrified he wouldn't come home, or that he'd come home dragged into a life she had fought so hard to keep him away from. But every evening at 7:00 p.m. Marcus walked through the door, smelling of industrial soap and grease, tired but safe. He actually seemed proud. He talked about the cars, Ferraris, classic Mustangs, imports from Japan he'd only seen in video games. He talked about the strictness of the floor manager, but also about the respect. "Mr. Jinho doesn't yell," Marcus told her over dinner one night. "He just looks at you, and you know you better fix it." By the third week, things started to get strange. It began with the landlord. Mr. Henderson was a slumlord of the worst variety, a man who relished threatening eviction every time the rent was 2 days late. Michelle was dreading his knock. She was short $70 this month. When he arrived, she opened the door with her excuses ready, her stomach in knots. But Henderson didn't sneer. He looked pale, sweating profusely despite the chill. He held a clipboard. "Ms. Vance," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. I was checking the records. It seems there was an error in the accounting. A surplus." "A surplus," Michelle frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Henderson, I know I'm short." "No, no," he insisted, his voice high and nervous. "Paid in full, for the next 6 months. Actually, we're going to be fixing that radiator of yours tomorrow. Someone will come by at 9. He practically ran away down the hallway. Michelle stood in the doorway, bewildered. She checked her bank account. The money hadn't come from there. Then it was the grocery store. The owner, old Mr. Liu, who usually watched her like a hawk to make sure she didn't pocket a candy bar, waved her down. "Here, Michelle," he said, shoving a box of fresh produce and high-quality cuts of meat into her arms. "Supplier sent too much. Can't sell it all before it goes bad. You take it, for the kids." The meat was prime rib. It didn't look like surplus. The final straw was the backpack. Marcus came home with a brand new, high-durability school bag to replace his torn one. "Mr. Jinho said it was lying in the lost and found for a year," Marcus shrugged. "Said to take it." Michelle sat at her small, chipped kitchen table that night, the silence of the apartment heavy around her. The kids were asleep. The radiator was actually hissing with heat for the first time in years. The fridge was full. It wasn't luck, it wasn't God, it was him. The realization made her skin prickle. It was a debt she hadn't agreed to, a kindness that felt like a cage. She couldn't sleep. She threw on her coat, the same oversized one, and walked out into the night. She needed to know the price. The lights were still on at Lotus Automotive. The bay doors were closed, but the side office light spilled onto the pavement. Michelle knocked on the steel door. It opened a moment later. Jinho stood there, minus the jacket, his sleeves rolled up revealing forearms that were corded with muscle and marked with faint, jagged scars. He looked surprised to see her, his expression guarding itself instantly. "Ms. Vance, is Marcus in trouble?" "No," she said, stepping inside without being invited. "But I might be." Jinho stepped back to let her in, closing the door against the wind. "I don't follow." "The rent," she said, turning to face him. She felt small in the room, surrounded by leather chairs and the smell of expensive tobacco, but she refused to shrink. "The groceries, the repairs, it's you." Jinho walked to his desk and poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher. He didn't deny it. He offered her a glass. "Marcus works hard. He has potential." "This isn't about Marcus working hard," she snapped, ignoring the water. "Sweeping floors doesn't pay 6 months of rent in this city. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Jinho took a sip of his water, leaning against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. He studied her. He saw a woman who had probably been taken advantage of by men her entire life, a woman who equated generosity with a prelude to exploitation. "I have no designs on you, Michelle," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded intimate in the quiet office. "And I don't give charity." "Then what is it?" "Investment," he said simply. "Your son destroyed my property. I gave him a chance. He took it. He shows character. Character comes from upbringing. You are raising 3 children alone in a district where most men break before they hit 20. You are fighting a war every day." He set the glass down. "I respect soldiers." Michelle felt the anger drain out of her, replaced by a confusing mix of relief and wariness. "I can't pay you back for the rent. Not yet. I didn't ask you to. I don't like owing people, especially people like you." "People like me?" Jinho raised an eyebrow. "And what are people like me?" "Dangerous men," she whispered. Jinho stepped closer. The space between them seemed to charge with static electricity. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. "The world is dangerous, Michelle. Sometimes the only way to survive the wolves is to have a tiger at your gate." "Is that what you are, my tiger?" "I am merely a neighbor," he said softly. "Go home to your children. The debt is Marcus's to work off. The rest. Consider it a balance to the universe. I take a lot from this city. Sometimes I put something back." Michelle looked at him, searching for the lie but found only a strange, dark solitude in his eyes. She nodded once, turned and walked out. As she walked back to her apartment, she felt it for the first time in years, the feeling of not being entirely, terrifyingly alone. She didn't know that from the window of the shop. Jinho watched her until she turned the corner, his hand resting on the phone that had just buzzed with a message. A message that warned of a new player moving into the territory. A message that meant the peace of the Ironworks district was about to shatter. But for tonight, under the invisible umbrella of the boss's protection, she slept. The peace that Jinho had bought for Michelle lasted exactly 2 months. It was a golden, fragile season where the radiators hissed with warmth, the fridge stayed full, and Marcus's grades actually began to improve. But in the Ironworks district, peace was never a permanent state. It was just a deep breath before the plunge. It started with the graffiti. Jagged, red spray paint began to appear over the discreet lotus flower emblems that marked Jinho's territory. It wasn't art. It was a territorial pissing contest. Then came the noise. The quiet, disciplined rhythm of the neighborhood was shattered by revving motorcycles and music that shook the windows at 3 a.m. A new breed of predator had entered the water. They called themselves the Razors, a chaotic, drug-fueled outfit pushing in from the south, hungry for the port access that the Ironworks controlled. Unlike Jinho's organization, which operated with a cold, corporate efficiency, the Razors thrived on fear and chaos. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. Michelle was walking home from her shift at the diner, the air thick with humidity. As she turned onto her block, she smelled smoke, acrid chemical smoke that burned the back of her throat. Mr. Liu's grocery store was gone. The windows were blown out, the interior a blackened maw of charred shelves and melted plastic. Firefighters were dousing the last of the smoldering ruin. Mr. Liu was sitting on the curb, his head in his hands, weeping. He hadn't paid the new protection, tax the Razors demanded because he had already paid Jinho. The Razors didn't care about double jeopardy, they just wanted to send a message. Michelle stood frozen, clutching her purse. The message was clear. The Lotus could no longer protect them. She hurried home, locking the 3 deadbolts on her door. Marcus was already there, packing the small living room. He looked older than his 15 years, his jaw set in a way that reminded her too much of the men standing guard outside the auto shop. "You're not going to work tomorrow," Michelle said, her voice trembling as she started dinner. "Mom, I have to," Marcus said, stopping his packing. "Mr. Jinho needs everyone, the shop is. It's tense. The guys are double shifting." "It's a war zone, Marcus. Did you see Mr. Liu?" "That's why I have to go," Marcus shouted, the outburst startling them both. "Mr. Jinho is the only reason this block hasn't burned down yet. If he loses, the Razors take over. Do you know what they do to women, to kids? Jinho pays for Elijah's asthma meds. He pays for the heat. I'm not quitting." Michelle looked at her son and realized with a jolt of terror that he wasn't just working off a debt anymore. He was loyal. He had found a father figure in the cold, dangerous man who ran the neighborhood. The next few days were a blur of escalating tension. The streets emptied out as soon as the sun went down. The familiar faces of Jinho's men, stoic, well-dressed Koreans, were replaced or supplemented by harder, rougher mercenaries. The elegant silence of the Lotus automotive shop was replaced by the constant, frenetic energy of a bunker under siege. On Friday, the war came to Michelle's doorstep. She was rushing to pick up Zara from daycare. The shortcut through the alley behind the bakery was usually safe. Jinho's men kept it clear of junkies. But today, as she stepped into the shadows, 3 men blocked her path. They weren't wearing suits. They wore denim vests with razor blade patches, their eyes glazed and hostile. "You're the one of them sneered, stepping forward. He was wiry with rotting teeth. "The one the Lotus keeps as a pet." Michelle backed up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have to get my daughter." Lotus pays your rent, the man spat. We saw the records, we're taking over the collection now, and since you're pretty, maybe you can pay and trade. He lunged. Michelle screamed, swinging her heavy handbag. It connected with his face, but he just laughed, grabbing her wrist and twisting it painfully. She kicked out, catching him in the shin, but the other two moved in, boxing her against the brick wall. Panic, cold and white, flooded her vision. Then a shadow detached itself from the fire escape above. It landed with a heavy, sickening thud directly onto the man holding Michelle. Bones crunched. The man collapsed without a sound. Michelle gasped, pressing herself against the bricks. Standing over the fallen man was Jinho. He looked nothing like the composed businessman she knew. His expensive shirt was torn at the shoulder, stained with grease and blood. He held a collapsible steel baton in his right hand. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. The other two razors hesitated, then pulled knives. Jinho didn't wait. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He sidestepped a slash, bringing the baton down on a wrist with a sound like a cracking branch. He spun, driving his elbow into the throat of the third attacker. It was over in 10 seconds. It was brutal, efficient, and devoid of mercy. Jinho turned to Michelle. His chest was heaving, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead. There was a cut above his eyebrow, bleeding freely into his eye. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. "No," she breathed, shaking. "No, you're bleeding." "Go home," he ordered, wiping the blood from his eye, smearing it across his cheek. "Do not use the alleys. Do not go out after dark. I will have a man stationed at your door." "Jinho," she said, reaching out instinctively. She grabbed his arm. It was hard as rock, the muscles bunching under her touch. They said they know about the rent. They're watching me." "I know," he said grimly. "That is why I was here." He winced, his hand going to his side. For the first time, Michelle noticed a dark, wet patch spreading on his ribs. "You've been stabbed," she whispered, horror replacing the fear. "It is a scratch. It's soaking your shirt. You need a hospital." "No hospitals," he snapped. "Questions, police. I cannot afford the time." "Then come with me," she said. It wasn't a request. The mother in her, the woman who had patched up scraped knees and cut fingers for 15 years, took over. "My apartment is right there. I have a first aid kit. I can stitch it." He looked at her, ready to refuse. He looked at the chaos of the alley, the unconscious men, and then at her eyes. He saw the same iron will he had recognized the first night. He nodded once. The walk to her apartment was tense. Michelle checked every corner, her heart in her throat, while Jinho moved with a stiffness that betrayed his pain. Inside, she shooed the kids into the bedroom with a stern "stay there and play video games, don't come out." In the kitchen, under the harsh fluorescent light, Jinho sat on a wooden chair while Michelle cut away his shirt. The wound was a jagged slice along his ribs. It wasn't deep enough to hit an organ, but it was ugly and bleeding sluggishly. "This is going to hurt," she said, threading a needle with rubbing alcohol-soaked hands. She didn't have anesthetic. "Do it," Jinho said through gritted teeth. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. Jinho didn't make a sound, though his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the chair. He watched her face as she worked. He watched the furrow of concentration on her brow, the way she bit her lip. "Why?" he asked quietly when she was tying off the last stitch. "Why what?" She taped a piece of gauze over the wound. "Most people run from me, especially after seeing what I do." Michelle began cleaning up the bloody scraps. "You saved me. You saved my son. I don't run from people who help my family, Jinho. I don't care what the world calls them." She handed him a glass of water and 2 ibuprofen, painfully inadequate but all she had. He took them, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. "The razors," Jinho said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "They are not like the old gangs. They have no code. They are burning the district to the ground just to see if I will burn with it. Can you stop them? Michelle asked. Jinho looked at the window where the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the kitchen floor. I don't know, he admitted. It was a confession he would never make to his lieutenant, never to Marcus. They are everywhere. They strike random targets. My men are soldiers. They know how to fight an army. They do not know how to fight a swarm of locusts. I cannot see them coming. Michelle looked at him, this powerful, dangerous man who was slowly bleeding out in her kitchen. She thought about the neighborhood. She thought about Mr. Liu weeping on the curb. She thought about the old ladies on the stoops who saw everything, the kids playing stickball who knew every shortcut, the diner waitresses who heard every whispered conversation. Jinho had money, he had muscle, he had weapons, but he was an outsider looking down from his ivory tower. He didn't know the heartbeat of the streets, not the way she did. You're losing because you're fighting them from above, Michelle said slowly. Jinho looked up, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? You sit in your shop, your men sit in their cars, you wait for them to break something and then you punish them. But by then it's too late. The store is burned. The person is hurt. I cannot be everywhere. No, Michelle said, a plan forming in her mind, crazy, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. But we are. We. The people who live here, the people you're trying to protect, the razors. They don't look at us. To them, we're just furniture, background noise. I serve coffee to these guys at the diner. I hear them bragging. Mrs. Higgins watches them sell drugs from her third-floor window. The kids know where they sleep. Jinho studied her, the pain in his side momentarily forgotten. Civilians cannot get involved, Michelle. It is too dangerous. We are already involved, she argued, her voice rising. They are burning our homes. You can't do this alone, Jinho. You have the fist, but you don't have the eyes. You're blind. She stepped closer to him, invading his space, fueled by a mixture of rage and a fierce need to protect what was hers. I know every door in this district. I know who needs money, who holds a grudge, and who sees everything. I can give you the one thing you don't have. And what is that? Jinho asked, his voice barely a whisper, mesmerized by her fire. Intel, she said. I become your eyes, I become your ears. I organize the neighborhood. We tell you where they are before they strike. We tell you who the leaders are. We give you the targets. You want to be an informant. No, Michelle said, her gaze steady. I want to be a partner, a silent one. You protect us, really protect us, and we help you win this war. Jinho stood up, wincing slightly. He towered over her, but for the first time they felt like equals. The air between them was thick, charged with the smell of blood and the electricity of a pact being formed. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed across her skin, rough against smooth. If they catch you, he said, they will kill you. If you lose, she countered, leaning slightly into his touch, they will kill us anyway. At least this way we fight back. Jinho looked into her eyes for a long, agonizing moment. He saw the mother, yes, but he also saw the queen of a kingdom he had only pretended to rule. Okay, he whispered, we fight. The transformation of the Ironworks district was invisible to the naked eye. The trash still piled up on collection days, the neon signs still flickered with spasmodic buzzing, and the fog still rolled in from the harbor like a wet, gray blanket. But beneath the surface, the frequency had changed. The neighborhood had stopped holding its breath and started listening. Michelle became the conductor of a silent, subterranean orchestra. She didn't carry a gun. She carried a notepad and a pot of coffee. Her command center was the counter of the diner on 4th Street. To the casual observer, she was just a waitress working a double shift, chatting with customers. But the conversations were coded. Old Mrs. Higgins, who spent her days staring out her third-floor window, would order tea and mention that 3 stray dogs were barking by the old textile mill at midnight. The delivery boy, sneaking a free donut, would complain about blocked alleys behind the tracks where the vans are parked. Michelle filtered it all. She learned to separate the paranoia from the facts. She built a mental map of the Razor's movements, where they slept, where they stashed their weapons, where they partied. Every night at 2:00 a.m., a black sedan would idle in the alley behind her apartment building. She would slip out, hand a folded piece of paper to the driver, never Jinho, usually one of his silent lieutenants, and disappear back inside. The results were immediate and devastating. When the Razors tried to move a shipment of stolen electronics through the rail yard, Jinho's men were waiting in the shadows of the shipping containers. The ambush was silent. No shots fired, just the dull thuds of batons and the screech of tires. When the Razors set up a meth lab in the basement of an abandoned school, the police, anonymously, received photos and coordinates before the first batch could be cooked. Jinho was dismantling them piece by piece, surgical strikes fueled by Michelle's eyes. For 3 weeks they were winning. The shift in power brought a shift in the air between Michelle and Jinho. It was no longer just a debt or a desperate alliance. It was a partnership forged in adrenaline. One rainy Tuesday, late at night, the black sedan didn't leave after she handed over the note. The window rolled down. "Get in," Jinho said. Michelle hesitated for a heartbeat, then opened the door and slid into the leather interior. It was warm, smelling of cedar and rain. Jinho looked tired. The bruises from the alley fight had faded to yellow, but the exhaustion was etched deep in the lines around his eyes. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of a suit jacket. He was in a white dress shirt, the top button undone, sleeves rolled up. "We hit their main cache tonight," he said, his voice low. "Based on the info about the laundromat, you were right. They were storing the guns in the dryers." "Did anyone get hurt?" she asked. "Only them," Jinho replied. He turned to look at her, and the intensity of his gaze made the air in the car feel thin. "You are dangerous, Michelle. I have generals who cannot strategize as well as you." "I'm just a mother protecting her cubs," she said, looking down at her hands, which were red and chapped from scrubbing diner tables. "A mother will burn the world down if she has to." Jinho reached out. His hand, cool and smooth, covered hers. It was a shocking contrast, the hand of a killer holding the hand of a waitress. He traced the line of a callus on her palm with his thumb. "And what happens when the fire goes out?" he asked softly. "What do you want when this is over? The debt is long paid. Marcus has worked off the car 3 times over." "I don't know," she whispered. Her heart was thudding a traitorous rhythm against her ribs. "I haven't thought that far ahead. Survival doesn't leave much room for dreaming." "Dream," he commanded gently. "Do you want to leave the Ironworks, go somewhere green, somewhere quiet?" "I don't want to run," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. "This is my home. It's dirty and it's loud, but it's mine. I just want it to be safe. I want Marcus to walk to school without looking over his shoulder. I want to not be afraid." Jinho tightened his grip on her hand. "I will make it safe, I promise you." He leaned in. The movement was slow, inevitable. Michelle didn't pull away. She saw the loneliness in him, a vast, dark ocean that matched her own. His face was inches from hers, his breath warm on her cheek. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Boss," the driver said from the front seat, his voice tight with apology. "We have movement at the perimeter." The spell shattered. Jinho pulled back, his mask of cold authority slamming back into place instantly. He looked at his phone. "Go," he told the driver. He looked back at Michelle. "Stay inside tonight. Lock the doors." He was gone before she could say goodbye. The retaliation came 2 days later. The Razors were bleeding, confused, and angry. Their leader, a man known only as Bishop, realized that their enemy wasn't just the Korean mob. It was the streets themselves. It happened at the diner. It was the lunch rush. The place was packed with dockworkers and mechanics. Michelle was pouring coffee when the bell above the door didn't just jingle, it was ripped off its hinges. Bishop walked in. He was a terrifying figure, skin pale as bone, covered in tattoos that climbed up his neck and onto his face. He was followed by 4 men carrying baseball bats and heavy chains. The diner went silent. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Bishop walked straight to the counter. He didn't look at the customers. He looked at Michelle. He knew. Somehow he knew. Perhaps he had seen her watching. Perhaps he had smelled the defiance on her. He swept his arm across the counter, sending the glass pie display crashing to the floor. Lemon meringue and cherry filling splattered across the linoleum mixed with shards of glass. "Service is terrible in this neighborhood," Bishop said, his voice a dry rasp. He picked up a sugar dispenser and hurled it into the mirror behind the bar, shattering it. Michelle stood her ground, though her knees were shaking so hard she had to lean against the prep station. "Get out," she said, "or I call the cops." "The cops," Bishop laughed. It was a dead sound. "The cops don't come here anymore, and your Korean boyfriend isn't here to save you." He leaned over the counter, grabbing Michelle by the front of her uniform. He pulled her close, his breath smelling of stale smoke and rot. "You think you're clever," he hissed. "You think you can whisper to the dragon and we won't hear. I know you're his eyes, so I'm going to gouge them out." He shoved her back. She stumbled, hitting the grill hood. "Tonight," Bishop announced to the terrified room, "tonight we burn the Lotus garage, and anyone caught on the street after sundown burns with it. This is razor territory now." He pointed a dirty finger at Michelle. "And you bring the boy, the one who works there. You bring him to the garage at midnight, or I come to your apartment, and I won't be polite." They left as violently as they arrived, overturning tables on their way out. Michelle stood amidst the wreckage, the silence of the room deafening. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her throat. He knew about Marcus. He was going to burn the shop. He was going to kill Jinho. She grabbed the diner phone. Dead line. They had cut the wires outside. She ran out the back door. She had to get to the shop. She had to warn Jinho. But as she stepped into the alley, she saw them. Razor scouts were posted on the rooftops. They were watching her. If she went to the garage, she'd lead them right to Jinho's weak points. If she did nothing, they would walk into an ambush. She needed a way to send a signal that the Razors wouldn't understand. She ran home, bursting through the door. Marcus was there looking terrified. "Mom, I heard, people are saying." "Pack a bag," she ordered, her voice surprisingly steady. "Take Elijah and Zara. Go to Mrs. Higgins' apartment on the 3rd floor. Do not come out. Do not make a sound." "Where are you going?" Marcus cried. "I have to go to work," she said. She went to the closet and pulled out the old, heavy flashlight she used for power outages. Then she grabbed the red tablecloth from the kitchen table. "Mom, don't." She grabbed Marcus by the shoulders. "You trust Mr. Jinho?" "Yes." "Then trust me. I'm going to end this." She kissed his forehead and ran out. She didn't go to the garage. Instead, she ran toward the old water tower that loomed over the center of the district. It was the highest point in the neighborhood, visible from the shop, visible from everywhere. The climb was grueling. The rusted ladder cut into her hands. The wind whipped at her coat, trying to tear her off the metal rungs. But she climbed, fueled by a mother's fury. She reached the catwalk at the top, the city spread out below her in a grid of gray and black. She could see the Lotus garage in the distance. It was dark, silent. Jinho was in there, likely preparing for a siege, unaware that the enemy wasn't coming for a fight. They were coming with incendiaries to burn him alive. She saw the Razors gathering 3 blocks away. A massive group. Molotov cocktails, chains, guns. They were moving like a horde. Michelle tied the red tablecloth over the lens of the heavy flashlight. She turned it on. A beam of blood-red light cut through the gloom. She aimed it not at the shop, but at the specific cluster of abandoned fuel tanks near the rail yard. The trap Jinho had told her about weeks ago, a place rigged for emergency disposal. Flash, flash, pause, flash. She repeated the signal. It was a desperate gamble. Would he look up? Would he understand? Inside the darkened office of Lotus Automotive, Jinho was loading a magazine into a handgun. He was expecting a frontal assault. His men were positioned at the doors. "Sir," one of the men whispered, standing by the window. "The tower." Jinho moved to the window. He saw it. The red light piercing the darkness. It was frantic. It was signaling away from the shop. It was pointing to the tanks. He understood immediately. She wasn't calling for help. She was giving him targeting coordinates. She was telling him where the enemy was massing. "They aren't coming to the front door," Jinho realized, his eyes widening. "They are flanking through the rail yard. They want to burn us out from the vents." He turned to his men. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of the predator. "Change of plan," Jinho barked. "Team A, secure the ventilation shafts. Team B, flank the rail yard. We catch them in the open." He looked back at the tower one last time. The red light was still blinking, a lonely star in a violent sky. "Hold on, Michelle," he whispered. "Just hold on." But up on the tower, Michelle heard the screech of a rusted hinge behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. Bishop stood on the catwalk, blocking the ladder. He was smiling, and in his hand, he held a long, curved knife that glistened in the red light. "I told you," Bishop shouted over the wind. "I'm going to gouge the eyes out." Michelle backed up, hitting the railing. There was nowhere to run. She was 40 feet in the air, trapped with a monster, and her only weapon was a flashlight wrapped in a tablecloth. She gripped the heavy metal torch like a club. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She thought of Marcus. She thought of Zara and Elijah. "Come and get them," she snarled. Bishop lunged. The wind atop the water tower screamed like a living thing, tearing at Michelle's clothes, but she barely felt the cold. Her entire universe had narrowed down to the gleam of the knife in Bishop's hand and the face of the man who threatened her children. Bishop lunged, the blade arc aiming for her throat. Michelle didn't think. She reacted with the primal, adrenaline-fueled instinct of a cornered animal. She swung the heavy industrial flashlight with both hands. The metal casing connected with Bishop's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered onto the metal grating of the catwalk, skittering toward the edge. Bishop roared in pain, clutching his wrist, but his momentum carried him forward. He crashed into her, his weight slamming her against the waist-high railing. The rusted metal groaned under the impact. Michelle gasped as the air left her lungs, her back arching over the abyss of the dark city below. "You stupid bitch," Bishop screamed, his face inches from hers, spit flying. He abandoned the lost knife and wrapped his good hand around her throat. His fingers were like steel bands. Michelle clawed at his face, her nails digging into his skin, searching for eyes, for weakness. She couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in her vision. Below them, in the distance, the night lit up with sudden flashes of orange and white, gunfire near the fuel tanks. Jinho had engaged. The war had started, but Michelle was losing hers. Marcus, Elijah, Zara. The names were a drumbeat in her fatting consciousness. If I die, he finds them. No. The rage that exploded in her chest wasn't hot. It was cold as absolute zero. It was the fury that allowed mothers to lift cars off trapped toddlers. Michelle stopped clawing at his face and jammed her thumbs deep into the soft hollow of his throat, pressing with every ounce of strength she possessed. Bishop gagged, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Michelle brought her knee up, driving it hard into his groin. As he doubled over, wheezing, she didn't retreat. She grabbed the collar of his leather jacket and slammed her forehead into the bridge of his nose. The crunch was audible over the wind. Bishop stumbled back, blinded by pain and blood, teetering on the slippery grating. Michelle stood panting, the heavy flashlight gripped in her hand again. She was shaking, bruised, and terrified, but she was standing. "I told you," she wheezed, her voice raspy. "Don't touch my family." Bishop wiped the blood from his eyes, a low, guttural growl rising in his throat. He looked at her with pure hatred. "I'm going to throw you off this roof," he whispered. He crouched, preparing to tackle her to take them both over the edge. Suddenly, the metal ladder behind Michelle vibrated violently. A hand gripped the top rung, a hand in a ruined dress shirt, knuckles bloody. Jinho pulled himself onto the catwalk. He was heaving for breath, sweat dripping from his face, his eyes wild. He had climbed 40 feet in record time, driven by the red signal light. He saw Bishop crouched to spring. He saw Michelle, battered but defiant, holding the flashlight like a war hammer. "Bishop," Jinho's voice was a thunder crack. Bishop spun around, surprised. That split second was his mistake. Jinho didn't posture. He didn't monologue. He moved with the terrifying speed of the tiger Michelle had once named him. He closed the distance in 2 strides, ducking under Bishop's wild haymaker. Jinho grabbed Bishop by the lapels and the belt, using the Razor leader's own momentum against him. With a roar of exertion, Jinho pivoted and slammed Bishop into the railing. The rusted bolts, already weakened from the earlier impact, finally gave way. There was a screech of tearing metal. Bishop flailed, grabbing at the air, his eyes wide with sudden realization, and then he was gone. There was no scream, just the long, dark drop and a dull, final thud far below on the concrete. Silence returned to the top of the tower, save for the howling wind. Jinho stood by the broken railing, staring down into the darkness. His chest was heaving. Slowly, he turned to Michelle. She dropped the flashlight. Her legs, finally realizing the danger was over, turned to water. She crumbled toward the grating. Jinho caught her before her knees hit the metal. He pulled her into him, burying his face in her neck, his arms wrapping around her so tightly it almost hurt. He was shaking. This man who faced armies without blinking was trembling. "You're alive," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "You're alive." Michelle clung to him, smelling the smoke and blood and expensive cologne. "I signaled you," she sobbed, the adrenaline crash hitting her in waves. "I signaled the tanks." "I saw," he said, pulling back to cup her face, his thumbs wiping away the tears and dirt. "You saved us. We ambushed them. The razors are broken. It's over, Michelle, it's done." He looked at the bruise forming on her neck, and his eyes darkened dangerously. But then he looked into her eyes and saw the fierce, unyielding light there. He realized then that she hadn't just needed saving. She had been the one holding the line. "I need to go to my kids," she whispered. "We go," he said, "together." The following spring came early to the Ironworks district. The gray fog seemed to lift a little higher, letting the pale sun warm the bricks of the row houses. Lotus Automotive had reopened 2 months ago, bigger and more secure than before. The sign out front now gleamed with fresh paint. Inside, the shop was humming with activity. Marcus was there, wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit that actually fit him now, learning how to rebuild a transmission under the watchful eye of the floor manager. He was safe. He walked to school with his head high, and nobody dared to touch him. Michelle walked down the street balancing a tray of coffees. The diner had been repaired. New windows, new mirrors, paid for by an anonymous donor that everyone knew was Jinho. But Michelle wasn't working at the diner anymore. She managed it now. She walked past the spot where the grocery store used to be. It was being rebuilt, the construction funded by the Lotus Community Initiative. Mrs. Higgins waved from her 3rd-floor window. The neighborhood was scarred, yes. There were still cracks in the pavement and shadows in the alleys, but the fear was gone. The razors were a bad memory, scattered to the winds. She turned into the bay doors of the garage. The mechanics nodded to her respectfully, not just because she was the boss's woman, but because the story of the lady on the tower had become neighborhood legend. They knew she had held the line. She walked up the stairs to the glass-walled office overlooking the shop floor. Jinho was at his desk, reviewing contracts. He looked up as she entered, and the hard, impassive mask he wore for the world instantly melted away. He stood up and walked around the desk. He looked different these days. The tension that used to coil in his shoulders was gone. He still wore the suits, he was still the boss, but he wasn't alone in the dark anymore. "Coffee," Michelle said, setting the cup on his desk. "And I brought the invoices for the bakery renovation. You're overpaying the contractors." Jinho smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I have to keep the local economy flowing." "You're a soft touch, Jinho," she teased, straightening his tie. "Only for you," he murmured, sliding his arms around her waist. He pulled her close and they stood there for a moment, looking out over the shop floor. They watched Marcus laughing with one of the other mechanics. They watched the life they had carved out of the chaos. "Do you regret it?" Jinho asked quietly, resting his chin on her head. "Getting involved, the danger." Michelle thought about the cold wind on the tower, the bruise on her neck that had taken weeks to fade, and the fear that had almost consumed her. Then she thought about the way Elijah slept through the night now, without waking up screaming. She thought about the way Jinho looked at her, like she was the anchor that kept his world from drifting away. "No," she said firmly, "I don't regret fighting for my home." Jinho turned her face up to his. "It is not just your home anymore, Michelle." "I know," she smiled, leaning up to kiss him. "It's our territory." The kiss was slow and deep, a promise kept. Outside, the rain began to fall again, washing the streets of the Ironworks district, but inside, everything was warm and safe, and finally at peace.